This is number seven podcast.
Number 7 podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the number 7 podcast channel. Today we're going to be diving into Sally Rooney's Intermezzo. It's a book that really, I think, explores the complexities of relationships in a really unique way. So we've got two main characters, Margaret, who's a woman in her 30s. She's, kind of figuring things out after her separation. And then we've got Ivan, this young chess prodigy in his early 20s. He's dealing with family issues and kind of a sense of disillusionment. And their paths kind of collide in this really unexpected way. It leads to a connection that neither of them could have really anticipated. So the story starts off, it kicks off with this kind of humorous encounter at a chess tournament. Margaret, who works at the art center that's hosting the tournament, she accidentally mistakes Ivan for a child. It's a little embarrassing for her, but there's this instant spark between them. Something that Margaret can't quite ignore. And in the second chapter, we're thrown right into the middle of this intense chess exhibition. And Ivan, being the prodigy he is going up against all sorts of opponents.
There's the seasoned player, Ollie. He's the captain of the chess club. Even a young girl who challenges Ivan in her own way. And Margaret's watching all of this unfold, and she becomes even more intrigued by Ivan. He's got this really unique blend of awkwardness and intelligence. It kind of sets him apart from everyone else. And then in chapter 3, we get to see a little bit more of Ivan's vulnerabilities. He opens up to Margaret about his struggles with chess. It turns out that his skills are declining, and it's really messing with his head. He used to dream of constantly improving, but now he's dealing with disappointment and confusion. It's a side of him that Margaret hasn't really seen before. Chapter 4 takes us away from Ivan for a little bit, and it focuses on Margaret's life outside of, their encounters. So we see her routine at the art center, how she interacts with her colleagues, and her close friendship with Anna. And there's this really telling conversation between Margaret and Anna about Ivan. Margaret is clearly attracted to him, but she's also conflicted. The age gap between them is significant, and she's worried about, what people might think.
It's a dilemma that I think a lot of us can probably relate to. Now, in chapter 5, we're introduced to Peter, Ivan's older brother. Peter's a lawyer, and he's got this complicated relationship with Sylvia. She's a professor. We also learn about Peter's past with Naomi. She's a woman who is facing eviction and arrest. And Peter's caught in the middle of all this, trying to help her, while also wrestling with his own feelings of grief and this lack of purpose in his life. It's clear that Peter's carrying around a lot of baggage. Chapter 6 brings Peter and Sylvia face to face again. They meet at a book launch. And the tension between them is just palpable. Even though they have this undeniable intellectual connection, you can tell that there's a lot of history between them. And it's not all good. Chapter 7 really dives deeper into Peter's conflicted emotions. So he's still drawn to Sylvia, despite the fact that he's involved with Naomi and, he's trying to help her with her legal troubles. But Peter ends up confessing his feelings to Sylvia, which leads to a pretty intense confrontation. Things take a little bit of a turn in chapter 8.
Margaret and Ivan decide to take a trip to the coast together. And as they spend more time together, their intimacy grows. But so does this sense that Ivan is holding something back. They have these deep conversations about their past relationships, their regrets, the things they've lost. And it's a moment of real connection for them. But it's also clear that there are still things left unsaid. Chapter 9 brings us back to Ivan's family life. We see that his relationship with his mother and her new partner is pretty strained. There's conflict over Ivan's dog, Alexei. And Ivan ends up taking Alexei from his mother's home. This whole situation really highlights Ivan's protective nature, but it also shows how impulsive he can be. His family life is messy, and it's clearly affecting him in ways that he may not even realize. And then in chapter 10, Ivan has this interesting encounter with Sylvia, Peter's ex. They get into a conversation about a logic puzzle, and Ivan casually mentions his relationship with Margaret, and it's a small detail. But it subtly suggests that Sylvia might still be more than just a friend to Peter.
And then in chapter 11, we see Peter trying to visit Sylvia when she's sick. This reveals a vulnerable side to Sylvia, and it kind of rekindles some of Peter's feelings of care and guilt. They have a conversation about their past relationship, and it's clear that there's a lot of unresolved pain and resentment between them. It's like they're both still carrying the weight of what happened. Chapter 12 shifts back to Margaret's perspective. So she's at the art center, juggling her work duties, dealing with the chaos of a piano recital. And she runs into Anna, and they talk about, family dynamics and the challenges that they're both facing in their personal lives. And Margaret's really struggling with her feelings for Ivan, and ultimately she makes the difficult decision to end their relationship. Chapter 13 focuses on Peter after his breakup with Naomi. He's just a mess emotionally, trying to process everything that's happened. And he reflects on his past with Sylvia, and he has this conversation with his friend Gary. about loss and moving on. It's clear that Peter's at a real crossroads in his life. Then things get really interesting in chapter 14.
Ivan goes to Peter's house in Kildare, and he unexpectedly runs into Naomi there, Peter's ex. The whole situation is just awkward and confusing, to say the least. And Naomi ends up revealing her past relationship with Peter, which leaves Ivan kind of reeling. He's starting to realize that his brother's life is a lot more complicated than he thought. Chapter 15 dives deeper into Ivan and Naomi's interactions. They find themselves connecting over their shared connection to Peter. Naomi expresses her concern for Peter. And Ivan is left grappling with all sorts of conflicting emotions about his brother. It's like he's seeing Peter in a whole new light. In chapter 16, we meet Peter's mother, Christine, and she's really worried about Peter and his strained relationship with Ivan. She urges Peter to reconcile with his brother, especially since they're both, grieving the loss of their father. Peter's clearly conflicted about it, but he eventually decides to go to Ivan's chess tournament and try to make things right. And then finally, in chapter 17, we get to the resolution of the story. Peter and Ivan have this really emotional reunion at the chess tournament.
They're both, dealing with the loss of their father. And they finally start to connect on a deeper level. And what's interesting is that Margaret is also at the tournament. And there's this subtle hint of a possible connection between her and Peter, which kind of leaves us wondering, what might happen next. It's a really poignant ending. It leaves you with a lot to think about. So that's the story of Intermezzo in a nutshell. It's a book about relationships, about loss, about the search for meaning in a world that can feel pretty chaotic. What did you guys think of the story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Number 7 podcast channel. We do more discussions on books that really make you think. And if there's a book you'd love to hear us explore, just leave a comment below. Thanks for listening. Okay, so we've kind of gone through the main points of the plot, but I think it's worth digging a little deeper into some of the smaller details, the things that really make Intermezzo so captivating. Like that first scene
where Margaret mistakes Ivan for a child at the tournament. It's funny, yeah. But it also kind of sets the tone for their whole relationship. Margaret's drawn to Ivan, partly because he seems so innocent and unassuming. She's coming out of this separation, and he kind of represents an escape from the complications of adult relationships. But as the story unfolds, we see that Ivan's, he's far from simple. He's brilliant, but he's also really insecure and emotionally kind of immature. And Margaret, even though she's attracted to him, she's constantly questioning their connection. The age gap weighs on her, and she's worried about what it all means, what their relationship means. And I think that's something a lot of us can relate to, those kinds of doubts and anxieties. It's interesting how Rooney uses the settings in the book to kind of reflect the character's inner turmoil. Like, remember that scene where Margaret and Ivan go swimming in the ocean and the water is freezing? It's this really visceral image that captures how they're both trying to numb themselves from their past pain. And then you have Peter's storyline,
which mainly takes place in this, kind of sterile legal world of Dublin. The office buildings, the rushed meetings, all the paperwork, it all adds to his feeling of detachment and disillusionment. And then there's Sylvia's apartment. With its minimalist design and all the books, it reflects her intellectual side, but also her tendency to be kind of emotionally guarded. Rooney's just so good at weaving those little details into the story. It creates this really rich and layered experience for the reader. And speaking of Sylvia, she's such a fascinating character. She's accomplished, intelligent, but she's also deeply wounded by her past with Peter. You see glimpses of her vulnerability, especially when she's sick, but she often hides behind her intellect. And her interactions with Ivan are really interesting. It's like she sees a younger version of Peter in him, and it both attracts and repels her. And then there's Peter, who's, going through a lot, grieving his father, trying to let go of Sylvia, making some pretty bad decisions in his personal life. His relationship with Naomi is particularly distractive, I think. He's clearly using her to fill the void left by Sylvia.
And it's painful to watch. But deep down, you can sense that Peter wants to redeem himself. He wants to be a good brother to Ivan. He wants to make things right with Sylvia. He wants to break free from these self-destructive patterns. But the question is, can he actually change? And what about Margaret? Will she be able to reconcile her desire for connection with the realities of life? These are some of the questions that Rooney leaves us pondering, I think. And that's the brilliance of Intermezzo. It's a story that stays with you long after you finish reading it. It prompts you to think about your own relationships and the choices that you make. So what stood out to you most in Intermezzo? Was it the characters, the writing style, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Number 7 podcast. We'll do more deep dives into, books that really make you think. Now let's talk about some of the central themes that run through Intermezzo. I think one of the most prominent ones is communication, or rather the lack of it. You see this everywhere in the book.
It's like Rooney is highlighting how we often struggle to express, our deepest needs and desires. Like, think about how Margaret and Ivan dance around each other, never really saying what they feel, or the strained silences between Peter and Ivan, filled with all this unspoken resentment and grief. Even Peter and Sylvia, despite their intellectual bond, they have trouble communicating honestly and openly. And it's heartbreaking in a way, because you can see how much these characters crave connection. But their own fears and insecurities get in the way. Another key theme is grief and loss. Each character is dealing with loss in some form. Margaret is mourning the end of her marriage. Ivan's coping with the death of his father. Peter's haunted by the loss of his relationship with Sylvia. And even Sylvia, I think, is grieving the life she could have had with Peter. Rooney explores all the different ways we handle loss. Denial, avoidance, anger, despair. She shows how grief can isolate us, but also bring us closer together, how it can tear us apart, but somehow connect us at the same time. And interwoven with these themes is the exploration of class and social dynamics. Margaret, even though she's educated and successful, she's very aware of her social standing. She feels like an outsider in the world of academia and the arts, constantly trying to keep up appearances. Ivan, on the other hand, is completely oblivious to these social nuances. He's more concerned with ideas and logic than, social status. And Peter, even though he comes from a privileged background, he's plagued by guilt and a sense of inadequacy. He feels like a fraud, always trying to prove himself to Sylvia in the world. Rooney's portrayal of these class dynamics is subtle, but it's really powerful. It shows how they shape our relationships and our sense of self. And then, of course, there's the overarching theme of love and connection. Despite all the heartache and challenges, the characters are all searching for love in their own ways. Margaret seeks it in her connection with Ivan, hoping to find solace and understanding. Ivan craves a connection with someone who sees him for who he is, beyond his chess skills. Peter longs to rekindle his lost love with Sylvia, believing that she's the key to his happiness. And Sylvia, though guarded, yearns for a love that can heal her past pain. But finding love isn't easy. Rooney shows us that it can be messy, complicated, and full of misunderstandings. She challenges us to confront our own insecurities and to embrace the complexities of human relationships. There's some specific passages in Intermezzo that I found particularly striking. Like, remember the scene where Ivan talks about the data analysis work he does for these tech companies? He talks about how he, inflates the hours he works, get paid more, and then he reflects on the nature of work itself. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "At least when I was a delivery driver, I knew what I was doing. Someone wanted a Big Mac, and I brought it to them. The amount they'll pay me to not leave the house is the amount I'll accept to leave the house, minus whatever the app takes, if you get me." I just thought that was so insightful because it speaks to this alienation and disconnect that we often feel in our work. In a world that's so obsessed with profit and efficiency, it's easy to lose sight of the purpose and meaning behind what we do. We become cogs in a machine, our value determined by our output. But Ivan's words remind us that there's something inherently human in the act of exchange, even in the most, mundane transactions. And then there's that really raw scene where Peter and Sylvia finally confront their past. Sylvia tells Peter, "If we had stayed together, you would have ended up hating me. And if you had left me, I would have hated you." It's such a powerful statement, I think. It captures how love can turn into resentment and regret. It speaks to the difficult choices we make in life, the sacrifices we make for love, and the painful consequences that can follow. And finally, I want to share a passage that captures Margaret's inner struggle, I think. She says, "I have been contained before, contained and directed by the trappings of ordinary life. Now I no longer feel contained or directed by these forces, no longer directed by anything at all. Life has slipped free of its netting." This really resonated with me because I think it speaks to our universal yearning for freedom and self-discovery. We all want a sense of agency in our lives, right? The freedom to make our own choices, to forge our own paths. But as Margaret discovers, that freedom can be both exhilarating and terrifying. It can open us up to these unexpected connections and experiences, but it can also leave us feeling lost and adrift. And I think that's what makes Intermezzo so powerful. It doesn't offer simple answers or tidy resolutions. It invites us to embrace the messiness and complexity of life, to confront our vulnerabilities, and to seek connection even when it's scary. So, we've talked a lot about Intermezzo, and I think one of the things that keeps coming back to me is this idea of searching for meaning. In a world that can feel, kind of meaningless. And you see that with Margaret, Ivan, and Peter. They're all at different stages of that search, I think. Margaret is she's kind of disillusioned with her marriage, all the compromises she's made. She's looking for something more, something real, something fulfilling. And for a while, she thinks maybe Ivan is the answer. But their relationship, it forces her to look at herself, her desires, her expectations. And it's not always easy. Ivan, on the other hand, he's just starting to ask those big questions about his talent, about work, about life in general. He's drawn to people who can offer him a different perspective, like Margaret or Sylvia. And then there's Peter. He's burdened by so much grief, guilt, this feeling of failure. He's trying to find his place. He's getting in his own way. And his relationship with Sylvia is a big part of that. I don't think Intermezzo gives us any easy answers about meaning or purpose, but that's what makes it so powerful, right? It makes you think about your own life, your own search for meaning. But even with all the darkness, there's still this sense of hope that even after loss, after heartbreak, there's still the possibility of connection, of growth, of even redemption. It's a reminder that life is messy, but it's also full of surprises and those unexpected moments of connection that can really make all the difference. So if you haven't read Intermezzo yet, I really recommend it. It's the kind of book that stays with you, makes you think, makes you feel. And for those of you who have read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What are your takeaways? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for listening to the Number 7 podcast. If there are any other books you'd like us to explore, just leave a comment. Until next time, happy reading.